You can look at these numbers and think, wow, it is absolutely insane that Baldur's Gate 3 got that many players. But I personally think the further you dive into the story, the more remarkable the current Baldur's Gate 3 situation becomes, and I think it may genuinely be a redefining moment for gaming overall. As you're almost certainly aware, Baldur's Gate 3 dropped this past week, and since its initial release, this game has been breaking all kinds of records. And I think the most impressive record, or really feat, was hit just yesterday. But we've also actually gotten some updates to the game to address some of the issues currently with it, and we even hear a bit about what could be coming next from Larian Studios. This weekend, Baldur's Gate 3 had a peak player count of over 800,000 on Steam, marking it as the 9th most played game on Steam ever, which is only elevated by the fact that the CEO of Larian expected 100,000 players at most during this time. The developers of Baldur's Gate 3 had their best estimates at 100,000 players, while in reality the first weekend alone did 8 times that. And if for some reason you aren't one of those players, you can get Baldur's Gate 3 DRM free right now on GOG using my affiliate code down below. What I think makes this whole situation all the more special is the monumental risk that Larian Studios took with Baldur's Gate 3. Something that I think just a ton of people are missing is that this game was in early access for the last 3 years. The developers released almost the entirety of Act 1 3 years ago, just basically giving everyone a 3-year early access to a massive chunk of the game, and that could have backfired in a major way, but instead they took 3 years of player feedback and ended up creating a masterpiece. But what I think ended up becoming the single most important decision around Baldur's Gate 3 was moving the release date. Baldur's Gate 3 was originally supposed to come out on August 31st for both PC and PS5. But then, all of a sudden, Starfield gets delayed, and then delayed a second time, and then, oh yeah, Bethesda decided to do some early access. So now, Starfield is also coming out on August 31st. Sorry about that, Larian. And to me, this honestly feels like a movie moment. The trillion-dollar corporation places their flagship release on the same day as the little indie studio, because evidently Microsoft didn't really view Larian as a major point of competition. But instead of Larian just sticking to that date or even delaying further into the year as many other devs would have, Larian said nah and did the unthinkable of actually moving up the release date to almost a full month earlier. And 800,000 players later, I think this could go down as one of the best management decisions in video game history. Even with the potential risk of additional crunch to get the game out in time, and of course whatever bugs are going to make it through as a result, and the pushback of the PS5 version now having a delayed release after the PC version. But what really happened is we have a time where Baldur's Gate 3 gets to completely dominate the video game sphere overall. There really just isn't much other news outside of Baldur's Gate 3, and it gives this game an opportunity to truly flourish and capture an entirely new audience. This will likely go down as the most successful CRPG of all time, and you can see in the reviews and even some of the commentary online. For a ton of players, this is one of the first CRPGs they have ever played, and many of them are absolutely loving it. I wouldn't be surprised if Baldur's Gate 3 is making a lot of other companies reevaluate their plans for their own games, perhaps implementing some more hardcore RPG mechanics. And even with a topic more relevant to this channel, the OG Fallouts. For years now, people have been calling for the OG Fallout to be remade in a 3D style very similar to other modern Bethesda games, but I think the success of Baldur's Gate 3 can make the likelihood of them remaining a CRPG still having that top-down style a lot higher. But the success of Baldur's Gate 3 is influencing consumer decision-making already. The crazy positive reception to Baldur's Gate 3, and likely just how massive this launch ended up being on PC, has dramatically increased the sales of Baldur's Gate 3. Since the PC release, the PS5 version of Baldur's Gate 3 has been slowly working its way up the ranks to now being the #1 best-selling pre-order on all of the PlayStation Network in the United States. And this is pretty important. This isn't just people wishlisting the game or saying they're excited for it. This is people actually putting their money where their mouth is and buying Baldur's Gate 3 already. Now, of course, Baldur's Gate 3 will almost certainly have a smaller release on PS5, but we're seeing in real time how PlayStation users are watching the release on PC and just buying the game in anticipation because things are going so well. Baldur's Gate 3 is of course also coming to Xbox, but they've had some issues getting split screen working on the Series S, so it seems like it's not going to make it to Xbox until 2024. But now, as many users and critics alike have had the opportunity to experience this game on PC, we've gotten some very interesting feedback, such as hitting a pretty wild milestone with the review score, as Baldur's Gate 3 is now the highest rated game to be released in 2023 on Metacritic overall, very notably passing Tears of the Kingdom for the #1 spot. And on OpenCritic, Baldur's Gate 3 right now is just 1 point below Tears of the Kingdom. And this creates a pretty wild stat where each main entry in the Baldur's Gate series has not only landed a score in the 90s, but each subsequent entry has gotten a higher score in the 90s. And as wild as all of this is, it's definitely still tentative. Due to its early release and its monumental size, very few reviews have actually been posted for Baldur's Gate 3 overall. I only got my review code on the day of release. And with how massive this game is, a lot of reviewers are taking a bit of time to get their reviews out, so the score could definitely change dramatically in one way or another. But honestly, as of right now, the reception has been overwhelmingly positive, so even if the score does go down, it'll still very likely remain in the high 90s. And perhaps more importantly, over the past couple of days, we have definitely seen a narrative shift. Many went from thinking Tears of the Kingdom and Starfield would have to battle it out for Game of the Year, to now many feeling that Baldur's Gate 3 could just end up stealing the show, which is absolutely wild. But we've also seen the developers being incredibly active with updates. The game has already gotten 2 hotfixes since release. There's been some pretty notable changes, like the version number no longer being plastered on screen at all times, which is very nice, as well as some miscellaneous fixes like missing undies or even having certain body parts clipped through clothing being addressed and fixed, with the biggest effort being around crashes or progress blocking bugs, or even some people just randomly being silent in dialogue so you couldn't hear what they're saying. And although these initial 2 hotfixes are great, especially with how fast they got posted, this is also an area that definitely needs a bit more love. Act 1 is mostly fine, but again, this has been around for a couple of years now, so they've had time to fix many issues. And unfortunately, what you'll find online is many players are reporting that issues are far more prevalent in both Acts 2 and 3, to the point where some entire quest lines are broken for some players. And it seems like what's going on is the game is so massive that many players simply haven't gotten to Act 2 or 3 yet. So as a result, many players haven't even hit some of the worst bugs yet. Now hopefully Larian can get to many of these bugs before players actually get to that stage of the game, but it does seem like it's a bit of a battle right now. Players progressing to the buggier stages of the game, while Larian desperately tries to fix those bugs before many players get there. Although there's likely more on the horizon from this studio, but it may not actually be with Baldur's Gate 3. Larian was seemingly one of the acquisition targets of Microsoft in the past, and when asked about this in a recent interview, the CEO of Larian said, "I'm getting older, but I'm certainly not done yet," and expressed no interest in selling the company, mainly due to how a corporate owner would limit their creative freedom. "We could do things in service of the games we're making," said the CEO, rather than pursuing a project management style that prioritizes efficiency and profit above all else. So even despite the fact that this would probably be the perfect time to sell the studio, the CEO is not interested, which is a really good thing if you like what you're seeing with Baldur's Gate 3. But at the same time, there may not actually be DLC for Baldur's Gate 3. The CEO has also described how Larian has not currently begun work on any expansions for this game. Many were hoping something like that would increase the level cap above 12, but the CEO describes how that would be quite difficult. Level 12 to 20 adventures require a different way of doing things. In terms of antagonists you're going to have to deal with, which require a lot of development to do them properly, which would make this much more of an expansion in terms of development effort. A lot of D&D adventures are sub-level 12 for precisely that reason. So it sounds like neat, easy expansion material until you start thinking about it and it's not as easy as one would imagine. One of the big issues being is as you get to some of these higher levels, the spells and abilities you have access to are almost godlike. So balancing and creating a game around that would become increasingly difficult as you get to some of those higher levels. But it's not the only reason, as the CEO also describes how with how many possible endings there are to Baldur's Gate 3, that too would be a massive challenge. There are a lot of choices you can make in Baldur's Gate 3. It's one of the best parts of the game, and having to account for a lot of those with an expansion or continuation of the story would be a monumental effort. But there still is good news, as the CEO continues on to say, "I know what we want to make, and the team also knows where we're heading. We'll see where that lands. I've learned in the past that you need to be careful announcing things before they're ready, because sometimes you have to cancel them because they don't work out. We could work on an expansion and it could be boring, and we should stop working on it. Because if we would continue on something that's boring, we'd then have to sell it to you, and then we'd have to say, here's a boring thing and we want you to buy it. That would not be cool. So we have the freedom to experiment and do our stuff. And then when we're ready to announce it, we will." So it seems like we find ourselves in an interesting situation with Baldur's Gate 3 right now, and that Larian definitely has future projects they want to work on. It almost sounds like the CEO knows exactly what they want to work on. I'm sure there'll be some prototyping and demoing of a potential expansion for Baldur's Gate 3, especially with how much money an expansion would obviously make for this game, but at the same time, it's not confirmed, and it really seems like they are overall uncertain. But honestly, of the games to not get DLC or an expansion, this is one I'm almost okay with. It just seems like there's so much content, so much choice here. The replayability and even just the original first-time playthrough length is insane that there's a lot of content here already, and if they want to move on to something smaller next, I'm perfectly okay with that. But if you are playing Baldur's Gate 3, check out this video, where I describe to you a bunch of features that you may have not known about.